For centuries, the world looked at Africa not as a continent of equals, but as a storehouse of raw wealth, a vault of resources waiting to be emptied. And while empires grew fat from the gold, diamonds, oil, cocoa, uranium, and timber extracted from African soil, the people who lived on that soil remained in poverty, chained not by shackles of iron, but by contracts, debts, and dependencies written in foreign capitals. And this paradox of richness without prosperity shaped Africa's relationship with the world for generations. But something has begun to change, something so profound that it is shaking the very foundations of global power. Because where once Africa quietly endured, now it is speaking. Where once leaders signed contracts that benefited others, now they are tearing those contracts up and declaring sovereignty. And where once the world assumed Africa would always be dependent, now the continent is daring to imagine a future in which dependence is not the destiny but dignity. Is eyed, rising from Accra to Kampala, from Niamey to Ouagadougou, and at the heart of this transformation stands a new generation of leaders. Among them, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, whose decisions have become both a rallying cry for Africans and a warning bell for the old powers of the world. For this is not just about economics, it is about psychology. It is about whether a people who were told for centuries they could not rise are now finally rising, and whether the system built to keep them down can adapt, or whether it will crack under the pressure. The story begins in the fields of Ghana, where gold has been dug since the age of kingdoms, traded across deserts and oceans, enriching others while leaving scars in the ground and hunger in the villages. But today Ghana demands that 20% of that gold be sold to its central bank, keeping wealth at home, strengthening reserves, reducing dependence on foreign currencies, and signaling that the time of bargains written in London or New York is over. And then in Uganda, coffee beans once shipped raw and cheap to Europe are now roasted, packaged, and branded at home, giving farmers more than pennies and forcing multinational corporations to compete on African terms. And in Gabon and Mozambique, raw timber no longer floats away in ships to Europe. Instead, industries rise locally, furniture factories, carpentry workshops, flooring companies creating jobs and pride, proving that forests can build not just wealth abroad but prosperity at home. Guinea, too, once a land where hunger stalked families, made the bold decision to hold back rice and maize and yams, declaring that no matter the profit abroad, sovereignty begins at the dinner table. A message as old as dignity itself. Feed your people first, trade later. And then Niger, where uranium dug by tired hands powered the lights of Paris while Niamey stayed dark, decided enough was enough, changing export rules that revealed a truth Europe never wanted spoken, that 70% of France's nuclear electricity was tied to Niger's soil, that European independence had always depended on African dependence, and now that dependence was breaking. Across the continent, leaders began to connect these dots. Namibia and the Democratic Republic of Congo looking at their lithium, cobalt, and copper, and saying if the world wants electric cars and renewable energy, it must invest in refining. Here, in Africa, not just strip the minerals and run. Zimbabwe refusing to export raw chrome. Ivory Coast restricting cocoa so that chocolate factories rise in Abidjan rather than Brussels. Every policy a cut in the web of dependency. Every law a statement that sovereignty is not for sale. And then came Burkina Faso, small, landlocked, often dismissed as fragile, stepping onto the stage with a voice louder than anyone expected. Because under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the nation declared that its gold, long flowing out in dust and ingots, would now be refined at home. That mines long managed by foreign operators would now be under national control. That the state's share in resources would grow, and that, for the first time in history, gold bars stamped with Burkina Faso's authority would emerge from a refinery on Burkinese soil. Over 100 direct jobs created, thousands of indirect. livelihoods supported, but more than jobs, it was about rewriting the story. For no longer would children grow up watching trucks carry away wealth they would never see again. Now they could watch as their own nation poured that wealth into gleaming bars of sovereignty. And in that act, Traoré sent a message heard not only in Africa, but in Beijing, Paris, Washington, and Moscow. The era of silent exploitation is ending. Western media framed these moves as risky, unstable, nationalist. But African newspapers called them justice, sovereignty, dignity. Words that had been whispered for too long, now shouted in the streets, painted in murals, sung in songs. Youth. Across the Sahel shared memes of Traoré, hashtags calling for unity, pride swelling in places where hope had been scarce. And yet with pride came risk, because history teaches that when weaker nations challenge entrenched powers, those powers do not yield quietly, they push back with sanctions, pressure, destabilization. Already whispers circulate of plots, of assassination attempts, of economic punishments. But still the tide rises, because people who have tasted dignity cannot easily go back to silence. Markets tremble, supply chains shift, analysts in European boardrooms warn of higher prices for cocoa, for uranium, for gold. But on the streets of Accra and Ouagadougou people smile, because finally, it is not them trembling, finally, it is not them begging. This is why the world watches Burkina Faso with such intensity. Because if a small landlocked nation can raise the flag of sovereignty and hold it high, then bigger nations might follow, and the old balance of power might collapse. This is why Traoré's speeches matter, why every refinery opening feels like a revolution, why the phrase resource nationalism is no longer an economic term, but a cultural identity, painted on walls, worn on shirts, whispered in prayers. Africa is not just resisting, it is rewriting the rules. And the question is not whether it can succeed, but whether the world is ready for Africa's success.